Welcome to the Women in Transport podcast. I'm your host, Shireen Ali Khan, and this is season 2, where we are covering everything intersectionality. We're looking at the layers that make us who we are. We're looking at privilege, looking at oppression, and really what makes us human. Welcome to this episode of the Women in Transport podcast. I'm your host, Shireen Ali Khan, and today I'm joined by Emma Langman-Maher, who is the Associate Director for Strategy Plus at AECOM and has recently been named one of the UK's most influential people in HR. So hello and congratulations, Emma.
Thank you very much, Shireen. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And I've really been looking forward to this episode. So since we met, I feel like there's just so many intersections and just things to cover. And so really been looking forward to having this chat and just bringing to life some of your story and how it might help other people in just being able to articulate and talk about some of the things that they might be either going through or just some of life. Like the whole point of the podcast really is around storytelling and just understanding that human journey. And so you're a human being. I'm going to ask you some questions about your human journey. So tell us a bit about your background and how your journey has shaped who you are today.
Certainly. Well, obviously, because this is for women in transport, I should probably share that I did start my career officially as a transport planner. But to say that I segued around after that and I segued my way to that would be the truth of the matter. Neither my life plan nor my career plan has really gone how I might have expected it to. And I think synchronicity has played a massive part in that and building relationships, both with other people, but also with myself and discovering who I am. So yeah, I was born in the mid-70s. I have the privilege now of being one of the oldest people in my team. And I really find being managed with some of the future generations is really good. Wild things happen, Shireen. Like I get told why I'm being asked to do something, which is, highly motivational. But yeah, it's. I started off not sure if I was going to go into sort of transportation or engineering, and I made that career choice on the flip of a coin around as I was choosing my A-levels. And it was literally a choice between either doing psychology with Russian or doing engineering with French.
Wow.
And, sometimes life literally can be the toss of a coin and it can change a lot of things.
Was it literally a toss of a coin?
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it because it's a phrase and you're like, no, it actually was the toss of a coin.
Yeah, no, it really was. So I guess one of the tropes around autistic people, and it turns out that I am autistic, is that, we don't necessarily understand metaphor, but the mirror of that is when I'm being literal, other people often think I'm using metaphor and I'm literally being literal. And the latest experience of that was this summer I remarried, and my husband and I had set out the entire plan for our wedding and what was going to happen. And that included that on the Saturday night, we'd be going down to a popular German-based supermarket and we would get everything with orange stickers. And that was going to be the wedding breakfast.
Love it.
And yeah, and that's what we did. And we fed the entire extended family for 145 quid on fabulous orange stickered grub, which they all enjoyed. But people were really surprised that we'd done what we said we were going to do. Yeah, so from my sort of neurotype, it's always surprising to me when people don't do what they say they're going to do. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, really, really interesting. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, when did you have your diagnosis and what was that journey? And did you know anything beforehand? Like, I'd really love to unpick a bit about that.
Yeah, I think I have always felt like a stranger in the world, and I always tried really, really hard to fit in. And I was really lucky, I think, because it turns out I went through my ADHD diagnosis that actually was last year at the age of 47. And as part of that, they pointed out that I'm autistic, which was just really odd to me because I think my family, obviously, it runs in families, is neurodivergent. And so I kind of felt that we were normal and the rest of the world was not normal. I think a lot of people in families that are often called neurospicing might feel that way. But yeah, certainly even from a very young age, I found it quite difficult to fit in and to understand what was going on. And I've always preferred really structured things like, doing Lego or playing board games, things where there are established rules of what you need to do. And I guess that's one of the reasons I was drawn towards the world of transport as well, because actually, when you think about it, it's a system of agreed rules that allow us to share the space together, and for different modes and different people with different priorities to actually be able to get along. And I think it's one of the really nice metaphors for how society can work. And I think that's probably what drew me to it. But finding that diagnosis out was interesting. I have alexithymia, so I find it quite difficult to put labels on my feelings. And even to this day, I can't really tell you what that was like. It was both shocking and completely not news.
Okay, wow, that's huge. And as somebody, as an outsider into that experience that you've had, that for me, that shows just some really extremes of something being both shocking but also very ordinary and not news. And I don't know how you would manage those two extremes at the same time. It's both like it is something and it can be something else at the same time. Is really big.
Yeah, and some of the stereotypes around autistic people are that, we have very black and white thinking. Many of us do. Obviously, every autistic person is different, just like any neurotypical or other brain is different. But in some respects, I'm able to really hold a dichotomy quite well. For example, I can understand that what a person has done isn't the right thing to have done. But I can also totally understand why they might have done that in the context with which they were based. And that's something I learned from my mum, actually. So one of my earliest big memories was the death of my brother when I was nearly 3. And kind of like being in that experience, but also observing that experience and observing how my family dealt with that, and in particular how my mum dealt with that. And I think one of the things that people can find surprising is how my mum was able to forgive some of the really atrocious behaviours that occurred, not only losing her son, but also how other people reacted to that. So one of those was from people with religious beliefs saying things to my mother like, well, if you'd really believed and if you'd prayed hard enough and stuff, he wouldn't have died. And my mum, she could have gone, I think a lot of people would have just gone, okay, well, religion is evil and therefore, I don't want that, or these people are bad, or to. And what my mum was able to do, even in the middle of that grief, was to work out what the need was that those people were facing in order that they would say those things, which is that nobody wants to think, or sorry, it's such an autistic thing to say, very few people probably wish to believe that a lot of life is outside your control. And I think that's why we have conspiracy theories, because it's less terrifying to believe in lizard people than it is to believe that, actually there's an element of randomness and we can't control everything. Kind of better to feel we're being controlled than that there is no control. And so what she recognised was the people who were saying things like that to her were saying it from their own fear that something could happen to them or to their family. And they weren't really thinking about her and her perspective. And that could have made her really bitter and angry, I think. But what she did was to use it as a way to think and to learn about other people. And that's something I've modelled my whole life. So more sort of comically at the other end of that, I did a keynote speech like a year or 2 ago to this group, and I was explaining about the journey I'd been on and how, I guess it must have been shortly after diagnosis, how actually I'm neurodivergent. And I was like, and it makes sense because I've spent my whole life studying people like they're ants. And the whole atmosphere just went out of this room. Like everyone just was like, and I thought, oh, okay. So I said very directly, oh, new data, human beings don't like being compared to ants. And the whole room, they just thought it was hilarious. And I was like, oh, okay, new data. Telling people that human beings don't like being compared to ants is funny for human beings. So it was kind of like this sort of meta cycle, really amusing. And I find that a lot, really, that it's been really hard for me to get into my own life, Shireen. And I think a lot of people who have gone through trauma or are neurodivergent or have faced mental health issues, that feeling of not being in your own life, and it's sort of almost as if you're watching it from underwater, and not being in your own body. And I think something we don't talk about enough is the physical pain of grief, of trauma, of depression, and so forth. And which was a huge thing, and I have come through that, and I can share that as well if that's something people might want to hear about.
Absolutely. I just there's something really beautiful about the way you speak. Like, you really articulate what is quite just very deep and could be quite triggering topics, but you say them actually with such beauty. I can really hear it. Just I feel the way that you've been speaking is that you're really using that grief and that trauma to enable and to support and help. And even the way you just kind of discussed around the way your mum behaved at the time of losing your brother, there's a real empathy that I can feel that your mum was displaying in a time where, you know, she would have been forgiven for not showing any empathy, but there's obviously some kind of prioritization or understanding that, you know, what value comes from not being empathetic. And obviously I don't know your mum, but I can really feel that. And even when we talk about other people's behaviors, I'm learning more around other people's opinions are actually projections of their own fears. And so actually, should I own that? Should that form part of my imprint? And I'm learning more, actually, no, it's not. And similarly to you, I love human behavior and understanding where people come from. And so, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear more about that grief, how you've used it. But that trauma, we don't talk enough about trauma, and life is really traumatic. Yeah, absolutely. Please dive in further.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? Trauma is such a weird word because is it a transient or non-transient verb? So if you get hit over the head with a baseball bat, that's a trauma. But also we call the impact of that, the long-term mental health or brain injury or whatever, is also trauma. And I think that's really fascinating. And I think it's a bit of a flaw in the English language, to be honest, because I notice in other languages, for example, like in French or in Spanish, you might say, you know, I tengo hambre, I have hunger, as opposed to I am hungry. And I think we don't really distinguish too well between a state that is a temporary one and a state that is part of our being. And I think a lot of what I've been doing over many years now is trying to recognize that who I am is who I am. And for me, the diagnosis has been really helpful in that that's an internal part of my identity that helps to make sense of things. Whereas up until now, I kind of wanted some external validation, which I increasingly get the older that I am. But also I wanted to know where I fit. And if you're a person who literally on a coin toss could go and do psychology or do engineering, and you've got the A levels for that, then who are you? Because we describe ourselves as, you know, art students or engineering students, or we have these sort of identity labels. And even working in different sectors, I've worked in oil and gas, I've worked in retail, transportation, and there are some labels like polymath for that, but they're not very human. They're not very connecting. And I think it's also fascinating how we relate to AI and how we describe ourselves going forward. So recently, when I was applying for jobs, my CV is terrible for AI. It's just this crazy mishmash of loads of different careers and everything else. It's brilliant for my job, but getting from not having this job to getting this job involved going through this weird linear process that expected my CV to look a certain way. And even to this day, you know, we expect children and young people at age 16, 18 to know what career they're going into, even though most of those careers don't exist. And then we get surprised when organizations are full of silo behavior and people who aren't empathetic towards others and don't work well to get across boundaries. And we can't do that. If we're going to face the challenges that we need to face as humanity, then we have got to be learning to look across boundaries and understand different perspectives and look at problems very differently. And I think that's quite exciting. So the intellectual piece of my neurodiversity and how my brain works, everything else, hasn't ever really been a problem. I've always been able to do that. And the ADHD and autism kind of makes sense as labels for why I've got that capability. The difficult bit has been the humanness, the being present in my body, the actually being right here in this moment. And especially when there's like a huge amount of sensory stuff, or you've got trauma stuck physically within you, of just not wanting to be in that body. So stepping even further back, the day I was born with extrophy of the bladder. So my bladder, my bowel, my womb, various parts of my body were outside my body, and that had to all sort of be popped back in. And I also had jaundice, and I also got pneumonia.
Oh my goodness.
So
I love how you say it in such a blasé fashion, like, yeah, this is just a thing that happened. Wow.
Well, hashtag facts. It just is what it is. And, as we were talking as sort of in the preparation for our conversation today, our own stories are deeply boring because we've lived them, right? So, it's like spending your whole life with only one book to read. It's like, okay,
absolutely.
this is my lived experience. And I guess that's why other people's stories are just so fascinating. And by the way, also why I think it's so important to be looking for connection and shared experience and shared understanding without the projection, that you were talking about before of, oh, well, when that happened to me, I felt this, therefore you must feel that too, because that's not how human beings are. We feel things and experience things uniquely. So being in that moment, being present in my own life has been quite demanding because I couldn't trust my own body, right from the beginning. And I was quite cross with it, frankly. And if you have that amount of physical disability, then there's a lot of surgery that goes with that. And not only that, but kind of like a being separated from yourself that goes with that. So I can remember surgeons coming up to my bedside and turning to their medical students and saying, this is the extra fee, and wanting to go, no, I'm not the extra fee, I'm Emma. And so that sort of dehumanizing thing. But then if I was a medic, perhaps I wouldn't be able to see the whole person, to see all the trauma that they're going through. Maybe I would have to only focus on sort of the mechanics, the biology of it. Yeah, so it took me until my divorce to finally be, okay, I am going to have to deal with some of this stuff, because essentially I'd had this rattling box of trauma that I'd been carrying around with me, a very nice one, it was a sort of high-end picnic basket of trauma, but the thing just kept rattling and it was becoming disabling in its own right. So when I was doing my coaching qualification, I really got the feedback that I was putting myself into it rather than it being about the coachee. And it was because almost everything was vibrating within me. So they would say something and it would rattle so many things in my own box that I could barely be present, let alone hear what they were saying or ask a useful question. And not long before the pandemic, so late 2019, one of my incredible friends, because I had been so ill, my income was really down, I'd been through the divorce, she just paid for me to go for EMDR therapy.
And what is that for our listeners? What is that therapy?
Yeah, so it's called something like eye movement desensitization and realignment or something like that. But basically, for me, talking therapies weren't helping. It was just playing the same record over and over again. And maybe there were some new scratches on the record, or it got distorted, or the needle was jumping, but it wasn't changing the soundtrack. And so going for EMDR was very different. And what that does is it sounds almost like hypnosis, except you're very aware of what's happening. You go and you choose, say, 3 really pivotal traumatic events, and then the therapist will help you to work out what the belief is that you've put with that event. So, for example, when my brother died, I had a very strong memory of standing in the doorway of his bedroom, aged about 3, and all his things had been packed up because my father's employer at the time basically said, look, you're no longer entitled to this house. We were living overseas. It was an overseas posting. And so now he only had 1 child and not 2. So we had to move. So on top of the trauma of losing my brother and watching my parents going through their grief, we also had to move house, which is just an inhumane thing in retrospect. So I had this really strong memory of standing at Alex's bedroom door and seeing, things had been boxed up and ready to be taken away. And this feeling of, well, I can't rely on anyone. And that had stayed with me right the way through from, what would that be, 1978, late 1978, right the way to sort of 2018, 19, of this sense that I could only rely on myself, can't depend on anybody else. And I took that into therapy and then chose what the replacement belief was. And the replacement belief was, that's over, because it is over. He isn't coming back. I haven't got to move house again, although I am, but not at anyone else's volition. And then you basically you can choose. It's again really thoughtfully done, either a visual stimulus, auditory stimulus, or a kinesthetic one, which is what I chose, which basically puts you into a binaural state. So the left and right half of your brain is properly connected. And then your therapist kind of goes with you into that past experience, and you describe it in a lot of detail. And then you knowingly and deliberately put in a false memory.
Wow.
Yeah. So I know it's a false memory, but when I think about those incidences and those things, my feeling isn't now, when I talk about Alex and all of that, I don't think, oh my goodness, I can only depend on me. My thought is, that's over now. And that's the sort of thing that's been implanted. One of them was, my therapist was a really gentle, lovely guy, beautiful human being. But one of the traumas involved another person behaving in horrendous ways. And in the renewed memory, I was basically superhuman, and this person suffered deeply at my hands. So my therapist was really funny. We got to a point where I was like, say to my therapist, no, that really is enough now. That's sufficient retribution. So really fascinating. And going back to what we're talking about, that dichotomy of the fantasy of violence being deeply related to the sense of peace. It's a most peculiar and powerful thing. And being able to hold these tensions is so important. And that's what I take into all of the work that I do, is to really understand, okay, what's going on here? Why might people behaving in these ways? How might they be feeling? And to hold the space for them and care deeply, deeply, deeply about them, but also to recognize it's a job. This is their stuff to deal with. I am not responsible for all of this. And I think that's been really important, because until this point in my life, I've probably been a hyper responsible person. And that has played out for some people as me being pretty controlling, actually.
Loads in there, Emma. Thank you for your vulnerability and just being able to go in there. And you mentioned before around trauma being this kind of mental pain, but actually the physical pain that comes into it. We hold physically onto a lot of trauma. How has, and you did touch upon this actually, about how you hold space for other people, but also knowing that it's not your responsibility to do the work for them. How else does that present you? So your experiences, how else have you been able to use them in a way where you're helping other people on their journeys?
Well, definitely my children. I'm now remarried, so I have 6 children, 3 who are my children through adoption, and my husband has 3 children as well. So we have 6 between 18 and 12.
That sounds like a lively household.
They're not all with us all of the time, but yeah, it is. And it's kind of in my youthful fantasies. I both wanted a massive family, but I also didn't want to have children, because even sort of, Jonathan Porritt and Rio de Janeiro 97 and all of that, I was really conscious about the planet even then. And it didn't seem to me that it was necessary for the world if my genetics continued. Like, there's nothing particularly remarkable about my genes. So I knew really early on that I wasn't planning to have any birth children, and adoption was absolutely my first choice. But I think it's helped me an awful lot with them, because adoption is the one trauma where society somehow expects people to be grateful for it and for it to all be magically okay. But if any person lost their siblings, their parents, their extended family, and were forced to take on a new surname and identity and live in a new place with a new group of people and accept that this is now somehow magically their family, if that happened to anybody else, we'd be like, that's not a sunshine and roses story tale, kind of fairy tale ending. That's really difficult, unbelievable, unimaginable. You know, I've lost my brother, and then when I was about 6, my grandmother was murdered, actually.
Oh my goodness.
And then in my teens, I lost my grandfather. So there's been like a lot of loss, but I still had both my parents. I still had my remaining siblings, my aunts, my uncles, and other people. To be completely untethered from your extended family and your roots, I can't even begin to really understand what that must feel like. But what it has meant is when my children found school really difficult and adolescence even more challenging, and some of the behaviors were things that most families wouldn't experience and frankly wouldn't tolerate, I was able, because of my losses as a child, to recognize to some extent the pain and difficulty that they were facing and why they might be working in these ways. And that's been really tough, especially there were a few years where I was a single mom, and the additional trauma that came from the systems around, education and health and social work was really, really hard to deal with. And I think one of the things I'm really lucky to have is both the fact that I'm white and the fact that I have a PhD. Because I am certain that if I didn't have my particular accent, which is sort of a generic middle class accent, which, by the way, does not go far back in my heritage in my family, if I didn't have this sort of voice and I didn't have, wasn't able to call myself doctor, and if I wasn't white, I think I don't even know whether we would have managed to get through those systemic challenges, around the children not attending school and therefore getting some threatening letters from the council and, all of these kinds of things. So that makes me really very cross, because if that was difficult for me to navigate with the amount of advantage in education and broader family support that I have, what chance does a 16-year-old care leaver or, somebody from the global majority facing discrimination, what chance do they have? So, yeah, we just need to do an awful lot better as society.
And I love that you've obviously been through a lot, but you're using it all as a way to not only unpack your own trauma and life, but how you support other people, and you still manage to recognize where there's privilege in that. And I think it takes a really strong, a really special person to be able to go through things and still say, but hey, I've got a little bit of privilege here, because that's not something that I think we should take for granted, just to have that ability to self-reflect. And it's really interesting when you mentioned certainly around race, but also that privilege around information. And I know just from certain life experiences that I've had, that I've still been able to recognize that I'm better off than somebody else who didn't have the information. And it's just really interesting that in 2024, or certainly, the times where some of those traumas have happened for yourself, we've been in a world where that information exists, but there are still some people who don't have it for whatever reason.
Hello, I'm Sonia Byers, Chief Exec of Women in Transport, and you're listening to the Women in Transport podcast. I'm proud of the work we're doing together to create a safe space for different women working in transport to share their stories. You can find details on how to join the conversation in the episode show notes.
Coming back to your neurodivergency, how do you think that that's affected some of the other life experiences that you've had, either to be able to deal with them, or any prejudice or kind of misconception, like you mentioned, around being a single parent, going through divorce? There's loads in there. I'd really love to find out how that's impacted you.
So I'm an intensely practical person, and maybe that's why I ended up in engineering as well. So intellectually capable, but I'm also really practical. And I can remember at high school, I was bullied such a lot because I was different. I was different in many ways. I grew up on the Welsh border from the age of 10, but prior to that, I'd been born in the South. I'd lived in Surrey. We'd lived in Kenya, in Yemen, been part of really privileged lifestyle. My parents had a share in a private aircraft when we lived in Kenya.
Wow.
So we used to fly from Nairobi to Mombasa, and just outrageous levels of, it's weird, we were grieving my brother, and it was hell, and yet it was also in many ways the high life, and we could go on safari and all of that. So when I then started sort of at primary school and into high school, one girl told all the other children at high school that I was incontinent and that I wore nappies. And that was incredibly difficult because then I got called all sorts of names, and the bullying was pretty intense, really.
How old are you then?
So it probably really kicked off around about the end of year 7, early year 8. And I can remember certainly by the age of 12 just being, I can't do this. I can't, there is a high mental health, and the permanent consequences of mental health are quite high in neurodivergent people. And I can remember even in my early teens thinking, I just can't bear this anymore. And I got into some really, so food and things like that became a real issue. But there was a girl from Australia, and she was a real outsider too. And I remember watching her decide whether she'd be friends with me as a fellow outsider or if she was going to try and blend in. And I remember watching her make that choice, and that was fascinating. She didn't choose me. Spoiler alert. But I ended up with other friends who were also different in other ways, like one girl who part of a circus family. So whenever she was there, we were really good friends. There was another girl who, long before the current sort of hoo-ha around identities, she pretty much thought she was a dog. So we were really good friends. She's fine, by the way. And then there was another girl who arrived at our school who had been a ballet dancer at Tring, and she used to carry herself so well, and she just had this whole sort of poise and was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And basically, she was so cool that she could be uncool and hang out with me. And that was then kind of cool. And she used to wear her hair a certain way, and she used to walk a certain way, and she spoke in a certain way. And we basically had this deal where I could completely model that. And I just copied it wholesale, pretty much. Yeah, and I think that's very much how autism presents in girls, is that we will read books and watch movies in order to model. So I don't read novels anymore at all, because the reason I was reading them was to try and work out what you were supposed to think, feel and do. And now I know what I think, feel and do. So I don't read novels because I wouldn't think and feel and do those things. So that's probably one of the earliest signs of that. One of the things that was amazing, as well as this girl letting me essentially take on her identity, which is really very classic for autistic girls, is that we'll see other people and we'll role model and copy chunks. So in addition to that, the other thing was the ADHD, of course. And the way I handled that was really, I was very lucky that because of my IQ, I was able to develop systems and processes to allow me to be able to make that work. So, for example, my timetable in my pencil case was all color-coded with my folders at home. Literally everything had dots on it. I set up revision systems that are really ADHD friendly, which I invented for myself. I'd have like a green topic that I already knew how to do, an amber that was tricky, and then a red one that I really didn't understand. So I'd just go green, amber, red all the time, and kind of like give myself a dopamine rush and an easy topic.
Oh, I like
so I did loads of those strategies long before I knew I had ADHD or how to handle it. And ultimately, if you look at it on paper, goodness, school absolutely worked for me. I left with 12 GCSEs and 5 A-levels. I got a first class degree, I got a PhD, but it was really, really miserable, and it came at a really high price. And even if you said to me today, Emma, if you go back to school, we'll take away all of your student debt and pay off your mortgage and make it all just easy for you, I would not do education again. And I think the way schools are now, the sort of behaviouralist approach in schools right now, I can't see that I would have survived in the education system as it is today.
It's interesting how the systems are meant to support people, but actually they're not. They don't support everyone. I know in my child's school they have and he's a primary school, and they've got things called dojo points, and essentially it's about behaviour. So when you say about this behaviouralist approach, I really see this, and it's about compliance, and the good kids get the stickers if you're not good. And I remember looking online, my child's school does not do this, but I was looking on Mumsnet or something, and they will put like almost names, like name and shame kids of who hasn't done well. And I suddenly thought, like, I'm really lucky that our school doesn't do that, because they recognise that actually that's not a motivator. But what about the kids who are a little bit different, or didn't have the right kind of breakfast at home? There's loads of reasons to why children play up at school, from the kind of most simplest to the actually more serious. And actually, you're not really helping those children. You're not enabling them. You're just pointing out things that are wrong in them, which for me is not a motivator. I'm a very carrot person, and I want reasons to be motivated, not to be told that I'm rubbish and be less rubbish. For me, that doesn't work. So yeah, I just find it really interesting. And what are we teaching the younger generation? Because they will go on to be the leaders of the future. And if we're telling them that this is the right way to treat people and the right way to seek value in people, then actually we're doing that the wrong way, I think. I do want to maybe touching upon the divorce and what it meant to be a single parent. But before that, when we were talking about trauma and where that's taken you around your way of thinking, but do you find it easy to compartmentalize because of maybe your neurodivergency or maybe some of the experiences, or does that not resonate for you?
No, everything's connected to everything else in my mind. And I guess we call that systems thinking in some ways, although that is a gross simplification of the school of thought that is systems thinking. Going back to the piece about naming and shaming doesn't motivate, it totally does. So my daughter was absolutely determined to get her name on the naughty kid board.
Oh, okay. So actually motivated in the other sense.
Correct.
Right. Yes,
Correct.
okay.
So she felt it was inevitable that she was going to get in trouble. And actually, she's been diagnosed with dyslexia. And so she kind of decided it was a badge of honor, and a bit like ASBOs, where people were saying that youngsters wanted an ASBO because it became a badge of honor. And really, that's about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And one of the advantages of my brain, which doesn't easily compartmentalize things, is that I can very easily see systems and the impact that systems have on people. And actually, that's become my special interest over the last, well, it's approaching 30 years now, of being just really fascinated by systems in all their glory. Probably more than that, actually, if you include the weather system. I remember even as a young thing being absolutely fascinated about how water evaporates and goes back in the sky and falls down again, and, circular systems and the circular economy and all of that kind of thing now. And yes, most of the performance of an individual doesn't come from that individual. It comes from the circumstances in which they find themselves, which again is a really challenging belief. A bit like when my brother died, it was really challenging for people to believe that that could happen to them and their family. It's also really difficult for a successful person to cope with the idea that their success might be due to factors outside of their control, which is, I think, why so many people, if you point out that they've got certain types of privilege, will say, oh yeah, but no, I'm the special case. I might be a straight white bloke, but in my childhood, this, and this, and this, because there's this drive, this need to sort of feel that in the event that everything collapsed, I independently could put it all back together again. And the fact of the matter is that you can't. And one of the things that really helped me to recover from mental illness was reaching that point of recognizing that it would not be possible for me to put myself back together again all by myself. And that it wasn't that I lacked the will or I wasn't trying hard enough to get well. It was just that actually things were going to need to align. And that included giving myself rest, giving myself time, waiting for that to happen. So when you're born as a fighter like I am, which is what the surgeon said on the first day of my life was, my goodness, this girl is a fighter, you sort of think, or I felt, that if I just tried hard enough and worked hard enough, I could overcome anything. And there are things you can do to improve your situation, but so much of your situation is about your situation. It's about which school you go to, which teacher you happen to connect with, all of that kind of stuff. And all of the things that have brought my life to what is objectively, subjectively, and in my view, a phenomenal place, have been about other people intervening in the system in order to support me. So, for example, when I was first self-employed, I wanted to do some work with Waitrose, and there was a person in Waitrose who wanted me to help on their leadership program. And she made sure that despite the fact that my company was new and a little tiny startup, that it was possible for me to get through the procurement processes. If she hadn't done that, I don't think I would have been able to work with her on that. And that goes through every tranche of life. I did another one of my many hats in my bizarre career. I spent a while as a senior lecturer.
Love it.
So I'd been a visiting fellow for many years in the Faculty of Engineering at Bristol on their systems engineering programme. And then over coffee, one of the systems engineering people and one of the people from the Graduate School of Education connected and recognised this was all about learning and how people learn. And so it made total sense in their eyes and my eyes to create a master's degree, which was about systems approaches to learning and leadership. And then I ended up being a lecturer on that course. And I say lecturer, but it was an inquiry-based course. So that's really interesting about how learning is connected to systems, is connected to transport, is connected to engineering. And ultimately, it just all boils down to connections, really. So no, I don't compartmentalise anything. But as I mentioned earlier when we were talking, it does make it quite hard to have a coherent CV.
Not too dissimilarly to you, my CV is quite project based and it's quite interest based, and I totally resonated when you said earlier about it doesn't work with AI because they don't pick up the things that they're looking for, and so I do feel like we lose out on opportunities. But it's people that then will bring you in for opportunities, and I think there's a real conversation around the use of AI in HR, and what do we as individuals do to enable ourselves, but also actually maybe people should be looking at that stuff, Maybe people should be making those decisions. But I find that I'm sometimes at the other end of what you've described. I find that I'm like really good at compartmentalizing, and it's really opened my eyes listening to you actually around, not that I've made assumptions, but I did kind of think that a lot of people who've been through trauma are really good at compartmentalizing. And the way I saw that was it almost being like your fight or flight, and your brain naturally just deletes memories. It will naturally, like I don't remember a lot of my childhood, just as an example. And so I felt that was my brain just saying, okay, Shireen, you're going to just focus on today and this box that's in front of you because that's all that you can deal with. And it's that protection piece. But actually, the way that you've described it is around things like everything is connected. And I intellectually can understand that. And I can stand back and objectively look at a system and say, this is what's not working. But as you described earlier on, sometimes looking at your own life as an observer, I do have moments like that. And so I kind of just to understand trauma a bit more, and tell me more about the systems, because I feel like a lot of our systems are either broken or they're archaic or they haven't understood where people are at today. And I'd love to know from our listeners' perspective, and certainly from your HR expertise, how can we support people who've been either through trauma, but also people who are neurodivergent? Like, how can we offer that space of comfort and psychological safety where everyone has the opportunity to be able to either articulate their own vulnerabilities and needs, but ultimately people can thrive?
So there's something about having adaptive systems and having the ability to influence the situation within which you find yourself, and having enough structure and scaffolding for society to work. So we need tax systems in order that we can fund our roads. It makes sense that road signs are consistent, so we all know what a stop sign means and what giveaways are and all of that type of stuff. But also enough flexibility within that to be able to choose stuff that works for you. So, for example, my employer, AECOM, I worked for them over 20 years ago, and actually I was made redundant. And it's been amazing to come back to nominally the same company 20 years later and discover that they absolutely mean what they say around flexible working. I work 40 hours a week, wherever I want to, at any time that I want to, as long as it works for my clients. And that means that I can work with my colleagues to deliver for those clients. And it makes completely sense. And I'm completely trusted to do that. And that means that I can adapt anything I want to play to my strengths and to allow me to use my energy helpfully. In our offices, for example, I get really irate if anyone's at a sit-stand desk and doesn't stand. Because for me, the sit-stand technology is a complete game changer. Being able to walk around, wear a Bluetooth headset, and all of that kind of stuff, noise cancelling in the office makes it a lot easier for me. And I think probably between neurodiversity and other needs, the hardest one to manage is probably going to be when we think about specific inputs of information. So visual, there will be some things that are important for people with a visual impairment that might be the opposite of what's comfortable for somebody who's autistic. So they might want to have high lighting, I might want to have really low, soft lighting. So what that means then is it's important that we've got adaptable lighting systems, which mean that we can do task-focused lighting when we need to. And that's simple. You just have different spaces in different zones and dimmer switches. These are not technically impossible things to handle. Or similarly, my husband's deaf, and so he needs a certain amount of noise in order to hear what you're saying. Whereas when I'm in a very overwhelmed state and my sensory inputs are too high, I really struggle with audio. So I might, sometimes I'll even sort of say to him, I'm just leaving the room because you're just too loud. And I mean, like breathing too loud or chewing too loud or just being too loud in your existence. And that doesn't mean that I don't love him. It just means I really need to put my head under a pillow and be under a weighted blanket for a while. So it's being able to adapt to those things and to not take offense or think that that's rude in some way. It's kind of altruistically selfish. So naming, this is what I really need right now to be the very best that I can be. Does that work for you? If not, okay, I'll go and do something that accommodates that need. And so when we design spaces, public transport, buildings, infrastructure, interchange hubs, all of those things, the more that we can think about, will this work for most people and what adaptations might we need, the better. And some of those as well, I think it's so exciting. I did a keynote a couple of months ago for Birmingham. They have this amazing innovation centre at the University of Birmingham around rail, just phenomenal. Look up Holly Foss on LinkedIn if you want to know more about it, but it's wonderful work that they do. And there was this fabulous presentation about visual impact and how important it is to think about the design and layout of steps, for example, so that you can see them and get up and down them safely and not be overwhelmed by visual clutter. And I think a lot of it, much of the time, is about really just simplifying and dialing things back to their function as well as thinking about form. And that's where that whole diversity piece comes in, doesn't it? That even if you were normally neurotypical, your hearing will be different from someone else. Your sense of smell, your sense of taste, how you literally see the world and interpret colours will be different. And therefore, it's really important that we listen to all kinds of people when we're making design decisions. And also coming back to purpose. So this simple thing around education. What is the purpose of education? I think we're still sat, well, it's a bit of a trope, but we're in that sort of post-industrialisation. School is a place where you can send your children so that you can work and they're prepared for the world of work, which for most people at that time would have been factories where you're expected to do repetitive tasks and not cause trouble. And actually, with the advent of machines and everything else, a lot of our jobs aren't in factories, and the education system doesn't need to break our spirit anymore. One of the weirdest things on leadership programs, including the one I did with the University of Bristol, is that many people in the workplace have stopped asking questions. They've stopped being curious and creative because they've learned not to be. And we're trying to teach things like resilience. Well, do you know what? Instead of saying to the individual, you need to be tough and survive in this really difficult system where we've got really demanding performance indicators and perhaps the bosses behave in some aggressive manners or whatever, instead of teaching individuals to be able to cope with that, we should be saying, well, no, actually, what's the very best way that we can work to get the very best out of our people? And that's what my employer's done. And it's not brain surgery. By the way, rocket science is apparently quite easy, according to my rocket scientist friends. It's not brain surgery. You can design for that and think about that. And if you don't, you do get perverse outcomes, which drive the very opposite behaviour to the one that you wanted. So anyway, rant.
There's so much in there. And I think our listeners will really enjoy hearing just the practical ways that we can genuinely hear people. And you really had me around the way we create spaces, like actual physical spaces, and just that use of office spaces versus brand new spaces being built. I think that's so interesting, because we do try to just try to cram everyone in the same space. It's like, just make it work. And actually, it sounds to me that if you do things mindfully and asking the right questions, which goes to your point around curiosity, you can actually create spaces that everyone can work with at the different times when they need it, because not everyone's need is linear either. I've got some quick fire questions. I'd really like to know what motivates you.
So, autistic response. What motivates me to do what?
Oh, okay. This is good. Good comeback. What motivates you to do the work that you do?
Right. What motivates me to do the work that I do is that we've got really complex issues as a world to deal with. And I'm excited that every project I work on now has something to do with social value and sustainability. And that's really important. I love new things. So I really enjoy being part of the business development, the relationship building, helping to craft how are we going to solve these issues with our clients. And with is really exciting for me. So I often seem countercultural because my relationships with clients are similar to my relationships with my friends. And that's because many years ago, I was working with a guy on a project, and I was in the habit of taking minutes after every client meeting. And he asked me if I minuted meetings with my friends in the pub. And I said, no, I don't do that. And he asked me why I would want worse relationships with my clients than with my friends, which was fascinating. So I never do that now. But what I do is I'll record what we've agreed and who said we're going to do what, mainly because otherwise I'll forget. But what that means then is you have to have really good decisions, because if you don't have good decisions, you don't have clear actions, and you don't know who's doing what, and things don't move forward. So what really motivates me is working with others to make complex problems, clearer, make good decisions, and then take action. What demotivates me is when people say they're going to do a thing and then don't do a thing, because in my little autistic head, that's just dishonest. Like, unless something really, really unexpected and unforeseen has come up, if you commit to do a thing, you should do the thing. But then we have that, again, dichotomy and that tension with my ADHD, which is that I don't know how long a thing's going to take. So literally, I will say to my boss, he'll ask me to do a task, like, could you go away and research this and write a paper? And I will ask him, is that like a half-day piece of work, or a week, or a month, or how do you see this? Because I genuinely don't really understand how long that thing is going to take, because I just don't see the world that way. It's really difficult to estimate how long things will take. So that's quite funny, given that I work in a world where there's loads of project and program management and people who are great at estimating those things. But that's fine. I'm just open about the fact that despite my age and having been around for a long time, I'm not great at doing that. So, and then weirdly, I get highly motivated by some really detail orientated tasks. I love proofreading. That's like so much fun. But other ones, or very repetitive tasks, I get very switched off by. So it just depends. But mostly, if I've promised somebody I'll do something, then no matter how I feel about the task, I will do the thing because of that person and because they need it.
And what motivates you as a parent?
If I'm not here, who will be here?
And my last question is, what would you tell your younger self?
Definitely, I would want to give my younger self some reassurance that things are going to work out. I wouldn't give her any advice. So people used to ask me to lighten up, be less serious, join in a bit more. I had a teacher who told my mother when I was being really bullied, he told her, well, the problem is Emma doesn't help herself. Well, I had no idea how to help myself. I didn't understand why I wasn't understanding how all these relationships and unwritten rules worked. I didn't know. So maybe it would have been helpful to know that I'm neurodivergent. Maybe, I don't know. But I think I would have told myself, listen, you are phenomenally strong and it is going to be all right. But I would have also let myself know that I wasn't imagining it, that it was tough, and that it was okay to be upset, it was okay to be exhausted, and that I wasn't imagining how tough it was.
Everything has been so well articulated. Emma, thank you so much. We've spoken around lots of different things. We've spoken around trust, around having adaptive systems, so really just that bespoke and that personal approach, because no two people are the same. I love that you mentioned around energy management, around being curious, staying curious, and you've spoken really well around how you've used past life traumas, but in a way to actually create empathy around you and help other people navigate just life in general, which provides lots of ups and downs, but actually how do you use that to keep you moving forward? And it sounds like you've done that with such grace. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed. Please engage with the podcast if you've got questions. I'm sure Emma was really happy to link in, and we'll join you on your next adventure. I mean, I've learned so much about you today, so whenever you're doing a next keynote, I'll happily come and sit in the audience there. Thank you so much, Emma, and join me on the next episode of the Women in Transport podcast.